Dog, how you been, man? Tell us about what you've been doing, this pandemic thing, man. I think, the situation is getting a little bit better in some cases, right?
hmm hmm Yeah, no, I've been trying to live life, and if you can understand from what I've been promoting and trying to preach for quite some time,
Right.
trying to establish your own normality. So whatever it is that you do on a daily basis, you have to do some form of that. So I've been preaching that since March, and I
Right.
certainly have been doing the same myself. So things have been pretty good. I'm hoping things are well with you as well.
We doing, man. We staying strong, that's all we can do. Last time when we were here, I didn't really take you back to your background, So give us that your background,
Yeah.
maybe encouragement as well, So
Sure. No, this is important. I
mhm,
think for mental health stigma reduction, for just kind of
mhm,
normalizing, seeing our younger inner city youth, seeing people like you and I who are
right,
doing things outside of sports and music, and there's
right,
other things that you can do in life to make a dollar and
mhm,
so forth. But I'm born and raised in Oakland, California, so I'm a
mhm,
proud Oaklander, and I am a clinical psychologist. So
mhm,
for those people who don't necessarily know what a psychologist does, we work with people to try
mhm,
to improve their life in many ways. And sometimes we
mhm,
have people who have severe mental conditions, such as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or depression or an anxiety disorder. And sometimes we have folks who just have kind of like relationship issues and work related stress. So that's
mhm.
just kind of the general sort of version of it, where I work with individuals to try to get them to a better place. But in general, I'm same guy. You look at photos from me when I was growing up in Oakland, California, it's going to look a lot like our youth. So
Yeah,
I'm definitely a
yeah.
proud Oaklander.
I think if you still look, the same, because I remember the first time because Mariah took me
Uh-huh.
uh, I don't know. I'm not quite sure if that was your house. But it was just a bunch of you guys, playing pool.
Sure.
I think you guys were like around 1920.
Okay. Okay.
You know,
That
you
was a
know,
long time ago, son.
that's a long time ago.
A long time ago.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
impressed with your memory there. So that
yeah. No,
definitely.
no, no. I still remember that. I still remember that. But
Sure.
you guys were cool. You were like, this African dude. So
Yeah.
he's one of ours. So
Exactly.
so you
Exactly.
guys treated me well. So let's just get right into it, man. We
Okay.
want to understand this issue of addiction, because it's been really, really, problematic, just not only in the US but around the world. First of all, can you explain to us what is, addiction?
Yeah.
Mhm,
Th- That's an important question, just because people who don't have a background in either medicine or psychology kind of think it's a choice, right? Like, why
mhm.
can't you just stop doing what you're doing?
Yeah.
And essentially, an addiction has a physiological connection, meaning it affects some aspect of your body, right?
Mhm,
Same thing like if you have diabetes. When you have diabetes, that's a lifelong condition, and you're going to require certain procedures to kind of keep yourself in line. And of course, you can do diet and exercise to kind of keep it down as well. But addiction has a physiological component to it.
mhm,
And to make it plain or clear for the listeners, when we enjoy something, it doesn't have to be just a drug or alcohol, but when we enjoy something, it affects the pleasure center of our brain, right? So
mhm,
the reward center is then reinforced, and it
mhm,
actually produces a lot of a
mhm,
substance that keeps us wanting more and more of that thing. So whether
mhm,
it's alcohol or whether it's marijuana or whether it's cocaine or whether it's something else, if
mhm,
in fact the result that you get from it is reward, there's going to be neural pathways in your brain that create that connection, and they want more of that in the future. So when it comes to why is it that we are addicted, and why are we even using the term addiction, is because by presenting yourself to that substance or that thing, you are creating a neural pathway between that, and the reward center is certainly being affected at the physiological level.
Wow, that's pretty deep, man. That's pretty deep. I love it. So talk to us about how the use of substance, produces so much craving that an addicted person can't even control it. And maybe you just talk to us about the science of addiction. I mean, you touched a
Yeah,
little bit on it though.
yeah, yeah. Well, let me say this above and beyond what I just mentioned a moment ago.
Mhm.
We have to realize that us as human beings in this world, we go through a lot of stress, and
Mhm.
everyone can empathize just with 2020, given that we've been restricted in terms of what we can and can't do. And it's changed everyone's lives to try to keep this pandemic from taking us out and the human race in general. So that's a form of stress. But imagine that you have financial stress, meaning you don't know how you're going to pay your bills next month. You're worried about getting evicted. Maybe you don't have a job. You don't have looking out in the future, there's nothing that looks like it's going to open up for you. Maybe your family has ostracized you. Maybe you're in a relationship. That relationship no longer is the case. Maybe you have children. There's lots of things that actually can create a high level of stress.
Mm.
And at the end of the day, many people sit up at night and they perseverate about it, meaning that they overthink and their thoughts are negativistic and catastrophic, and they kind of just go there. So, guess what happens when you follow a negative thought with another negative thought? You become even more stressed out and more worrisome, and the future is less optimistic. So, guess what? People tend to turn to things that are going to, in their mind, reduce their stress, whether it's temporary or whether it's forever. And as we know, with drugs and alcohol, there's a period of intoxication, and then there's a period where that substance is no longer in your body and you're called sober again. But during that intoxicated period, people will report feeling less stressed out, less worrisome about the things that bother them, and more in the moment. So, guess what people do? People tend to turn to that as one of many coping strategies to dealing with their stress. So,
Mm.
guess what happens? Over time, you require more and more of that substance to achieve the same outcome. So, if you
Mm.
felt really good the first time you did marijuana, for example, 6 months down the line, you're going to require more of that. So the brain and the body adjusts itself to foreign substances, and it doesn't recognize that cannabis anymore as something foreign. It says, okay, we're used to this. And so now it requires more and more of that to achieve that same outcome. So people chase that first high.
Mm.
People chase, trying to get to a point where they are no longer stressed out.
Mm.
And the brain still will produce dopamine, and it still will
Mm.
produce, dopamine to reward you in a way,
Mm.
but it becomes this vicious cycle
Mm.
where now you understand that you may only be intoxicated for 4 hours or for 3 hours, and
Mm.
you want to feel that way indefinitely. So, guess what people do? People use it throughout the day, throughout their week, in the evening, in the morning. And that addiction then can overtake their productivity. It can, of course, we all know people look differently. Sometimes they don't brush their teeth, depending on what the drug is, and their oral hygiene goes away. There's
Yeah.
lots of different effects of using drugs. And
Yeah.
then once again, it becomes this vicious cycle where you're chasing this high to deal with. And don't get me wrong, just dealing with stress is one of many reasons why people use drugs, but
Right.
it's a vicious cycle.
It is a vicious. Oh my goodness. I've seen some of those things that you're talking about. So finding of the adverse childhood experiences study
Mhm.
demonstrates that unrecognized adverse childhood experiences are a major factor underlying addiction. Uh, I don't know if you can explain this to us. Uh,
Yeah, just taking socioeconomics status for one. So whether you're middle, uh, lower class, or rich and kind of that high class, that certainly can have an effect
mm,
on your usage and potential addiction. It doesn't always predict it, because we know people who come from great family backgrounds. Their parents are completely loaded. They've had every opportunity in the world to be successful, yet they're still addicted to drugs. So it doesn't define it all, but imagine that you come from a part of town where there's garbage outside, and there aren't sufficient jobs, and the educational system is really bad. And guess what? The people who are around you tend to use drugs and alcohol at a higher rate. The younger people get exposed to it earlier, and they're experimenting with it just like anything else, right? They want to see what it is, what it's like. And guess what? You can be 4 years old and still achieve a dopamine sort of release. So that positive reinforcement to the physiological portions of your brain are still being affected. So there are many studies that show that adolescent and even younger people, children, use drugs and alcohol at a higher rate in places where it tends to be rougher parts of town.
Or can it be can the kids inherit, addiction?
Okay, so it's a good question. So the genetics of it.
Yeah.
And I'll say this first, Sonny. So there are lots of theories around this. And all of what we're talking about today, this is science, meaning that we come up with a theory and we test that theory out. And depending on our colleagues in the field, we're all in agreement about it, or we argue and we're not in agreement. So all of this is very much theoretical. But one of the theories about genetics really is one that says that personality is a big factor in terms of addiction. So, how your parents are personality wise doesn't mean you're going to be exactly that way, but there's a correlation between the two. So if your parent, and specifically the same gendered parent, so from father to son, as well as from mother to daughter, that genetic link is even stronger. So if your father, for example, has an addictive personality and he has kind of this gambling sort of personality, he's willing to kind of take risks and so forth. The theory says that you are more likely to engage in that same sort of personality style. So therefore, whether it's gambling, whether it's drugs and alcohol, or anything else that's addictive, and I guess that's one of the things we can talk about at some point. It's not just drugs and alcohol that are addictive sort of contents. It could be lots of different things. Right now, I have several clients who are addicted to things that are outside of drugs and alcohol. But to answer your question directly, that genetic link can be stronger. And of course, it's once again based on the theory, it's a little bit based on personality as opposed to it being some other version of it. But above and beyond that, from a medical or physiological standpoint, you might be more genetically predisposed to releasing more dopamine. So that reward center of your brain, when you engage in that substance, it might be more than me. And I might have like just a little bit. I'm like, this really doesn't do it for me. So certainly there's many theories around it, but within the psychological literature, we talk about personality link, and within the physiological or medical literature, they talk about it being more of the structures and the things that are passed down from parent to child.
There are those who say that, marijuana, he can be addicted. I don't know your take on that. Like some people like, who really like to smoke.
Sure. Sure. Well, let me say this. You can pretty much be addicted to almost anything, right?
Okay.
And so marijuana is definitely one of them. And let's talk about kind of the continuum, because I do think it's important in terms of understanding the continuum of anything that we do, but particularly since we're going to use a drug reference, because I think it's easier to understand.
It's easier to understand when you use a drug. Yeah.
There you go. So let's take cannabis, for example. So there can be, there's a continuum from usage to abuse to dependency. And dependency is where we kind of talk about addiction, right? So you can use a substance and use it wisely. And I mean, marijuana is legal in California, as it is in many states. So, at least the state has trusted us to be able to have dispensaries and use marijuana recreationally as well as medicinally. So use that's one stage. Abuse is where we start to see people will continue to use despite the negative consequences, right? So let's say that your spouse says you need to stop using because this is, you're spending all the money, you're
Yeah.
not paying attention to me.
Mhm.
Whatever negative consequences he or she identifies, they're upset about it. Let's say you also get a DUI. So you can get a DUI from cannabis, which some people don't realize, just like you can from alcohol. Let's also say that you lost your job, right?
Mhm.
So your supervisor noticed that you were looking sleepy on the job and they said, you know what, you got to go.
Mhm.
So if those negative consequences have happened and you continue to use, you are said to qualify at least to the second level, which is abuse, right? And of course, the frequency and magnitude, how much you use is a part of abuse as well. But,
Mhm.
and then we have dependency, which is once again the addictive piece. So what we say someone to be addicted or dependent is that they require a higher amount of that substance to achieve that desired effect. So that's tolerance. Tolerance is kind of kicking in, and their entire world can be kind of turned upside down and is occupied by this particular thing that they're addicted to.
Mhm.
So I wanted to make that part clear. I know we're 15 minutes into it, but
Yeah.
I wanted to at least paint that picture for it. But let
Right.
me answer your question now. So
Mhm.
can cannabis be or marijuana or weed be addictive? Yes, it can.
Mhm.
Same thing like going to the gym can be addictive. Same
Mhm.
thing like playing whatever sport that you enjoy can be addictive. So you have to remember again, Sonny. So addiction is targeting the pleasure center of your brain. It's a physiological thing. It's not just, oh, you're having fun. Your brain is releasing that feel good sort of medicine and you are feeling it, right? At a physiological level, you're experiencing that. And we like to feel good, right?
Mhm.
So now you're getting reinforcement for that, meaning that you are more likely to engage in that behavior again because it feels good, as opposed to something aversive, right? When
Mhm.
something's aversive to you, you don't like the way it feels and you're less likely to engage in that. And while we're talking about kind of aversion and pleasure, there actually is a drug
Mhm.
that doctors can prescribe for alcohol. It's called antabuse. And
Oh.
antabuse basically will make someone who's addicted to alcohol sick when they drink alcohol. So you have
Mhm.
to take this medication. I don't know if it's once or twice a day, but it's prescribed in that way. And
Mhm.
anytime they drink alcohol, they're going to feel nauseous and want to throw up. And so that's the aversion piece to it. So that's counter against the pleasure center, right? So if
Mhm.
your brain is now saying, I don't like the way that it feels when I drink that alcohol anymore, guess what? The reinforcement is going to reduce itself and you're less likely to want that thing again.
Wow. That's really really interesting. I want to go back a little bit. I was not
Okay.
gonna ask you this question, but I'll just ask you. So, what is the impact of marijuana use
Mhm.
uh, by adolescents or high school kids?
Yeah. Well, one thing we have to realize is that when you are an adolescent or even in your young teens, you're still growing, right? And
Mm.
so it's dangerous to introduce something, a drug um,
Mm.
into your body while
Mm.
you're still growing. And we don't know all of the long-term effects of anything, but most people will agree that it's not good, which is the same reason why when a woman is pregnant, they are really strict about what sorts of medication she can be on because you got a growing being inside of her. And so, with that being said, adolescents, there are many young people who can use alcohol and marijuana and
Mm.
not have huge negative effects.
Okay.
But there are that there's that 10%, that 15%
Mm.
that ends up really being connected to that thing. And
Mm.
maybe they don't have any other, this is the psychology behind it, right? But maybe they don't have any other version of what they engage in that gives them that level of pleasure.
Mm.
So imagine for them, life is rather bland.
Right.
They go to school, they don't really like school, they barely have any friends. They kind of connect with mom or dad, but not really. Now they found this thing that's kind of giving them this huge release of pleasure. So
Mm.
that's a dangerous thing for anyone,
Yeah.
but particularly when you're talking about a young person. So
Mm.
young people can get addicted. It's not necessarily in higher numbers than adults, but depending on their situation and the factors around it, it
mm,
could be worse for that individual, right? So
mm.
let's say that this young person's father is not in their life. And
Right,
let's say that the mother is also addicted to drugs. And
right,
let's say that they only eat, a meal once a day. Guess
right,
what? All
right,
those things certainly play into,
right.
well, this person can just kind
Yeah,
of have a situation where they get caught in that cycle as well.
right, right, right. Now that's a great answer for to that, and so I believe there's a connection between chronic stress, especially from the systemic racism to
Mm-hmm.
poor health, and then to substance abuse, right,
Hmm. Hmm.
and then to more diseases.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, no, you're completely right. And so, just to kind of throw in there,
Hmm.
um, where we are right now in society with racism feeling like it's more overt than
It's
maybe it has been in many
yeah,
people's lifetime, right?
yeah,
It's almost normalized in a way
mm,
that it hasn't been in the past. And of course, there's different
right,
geographical locations in the country where maybe it was that way, but it's certainly feeling like on a broad level, much more normalized. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the effect of that on an individual level for someone who's represented in that group? So if you're a person of color and um, the news and just different groups are out there promoting hate against your people,
mm,
what effect does that have on you? This goes
mm,
back to personality. You
mm,
have some young people who are going to talk about it and they're going to share their emotions about it and they're going to emote and they're going to cathart about it. Then you also have some young people who keep it within and they're hurting, but they have no outlet for it. And
mm,
so therefore they're suffering in silence and they're going through something that maybe the parents and everyone else doesn't even know about. And how does that, on top of all the other stressors that we've talked about and haven't talked about, but let's even just take body image. So some people, particularly younger people, you want to be this men, you want to be muscular. You got this ideal body type that the media has presented. You want to be that. And women, they want to be curvy and or slim, and they want to fit into that. So guess what? If you don't fit into that category, that's yet another stressor. Maybe you have a low self-esteem
mm,
and you don't like the way you look.
mm,
Every time you look in the mirror, it's pain as opposed to something that you can be proud of.
mm,
So all the different stressors, including racism,
mm,
including bad educational systems, including
mm,
systemic problems within our community, all
mm,
those things qualify as stressors.
mm,
And once again, Sonny, there are people who use different methods of stress reduction very effectively, and they're getting a version of a dopamine release,
mm,
right?
mm,
And they're perfectly fine. Some people go to the gym, some people travel, some people meditate, some people just like being around family, some people cook, some people have hobbies. There's thousands and thousands of ways in which you can manage stress. And some people take advantage of those and have learned about them, and some people haven't. And so that's important, an important distinction. But I want to make sure I'm answering your question.
yeah,
Racism and any level of personal perceived stress. It does. I mean, racism for some people,
mm,
it's been that way my whole life. I don't know any different. For
mm,
some other people, it's looking at themselves in the mirror and saying, "Guess what? I don't like the way I look." And that's like 12 times more impactful than racism really is. So I don't want to jump on racism as like the cause.
uh,
I want us all to understand that we
yeah,
all have our own personal perceptions of the different things in the environment, and
mm,
things affect us very much differently, right? So, for example,
mm,
you turn 16 and maybe you go to a school where there's people who have a lot of money, and every time someone turns 16, there is a brand new car waiting for them in the driveway.
yeah,
And then maybe for other folks, it's not that. And that can be, that in and of itself can be stressful. I'm
mm,
going to be perceived by other people to be poor. They're going to laugh at me. They're going to see me as less than them. And so
mm,
therefore, I'm not looking forward to that birthday. That can be just as impactful. But certainly racism in our modern day has taken over a different, it looks different and it's kind of more in your face. It's on a federal level. Arguably, the president,
Yeah.
shows some racist tendencies, and we're not going to get into politics today, but certainly people would argue that it's so much in your face that you have to deal with it. And here's the other thing, Sonny. Some groups don't have to deal with it, right? If
Mhm.
you're in a privileged particular group, all you really have to do is ask yourself, looking within and say, well, where do I fit in this line of being racist or not? As opposed to when you are on the road and police officer pulls by you, or you're on the elevator and someone clutches their purse,
Mhm.
or you are at the bank and you're trying to like all these things that we as people of color have to deal with. There are people who don't have to deal with that at all. So that's important to know as well.
Yeah. I watched this kid. He's my neighbor.
Mhm.
You know, he was taking the trash out of his house, and as he was going, as he was walking, he was also at the same time looking at his phone.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
and then I was like, man, a lot of parents lately, I've been studying that, they are worried that their children that have been, caught up in these gadgets, so I'm wondering if there's a correlation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
It goes back to one of my points that I said is
yeah,
that you can be addicted to anything,
yeah,
right? And
mhm,
so here's where the cell phone developers were really smart. And chances are they
mhm,
probably worked with an organizational psychologist at some point. But cell phones in particular, like social media or even just surfing the web, it's like a slot machine, and I'm gonna tell you why. So a
mhm.
slot machine, you're pulling, lose, pull again, lose, pull again, lose. But now I won, right? So the
It's
time
more
that
like
you
that.
win,
Yeah.
when you win, it triggers that pleasure portion of your brain that I've been referring to, and the dopamine release is
Mhm,
there. And imagine if you win a big jackpot, how
mhm,
much dopamine is released at that point. But the same thing happens when young people are on social media scrolling through the stories, right?
mhm,
So don't like this story, don't like this one. Oh, this is interesting. Maybe it's a video, and
mhm,
now the video makes you laugh, or maybe
mhm,
the video makes you smile or makes you cry. It
mhm,
doesn't matter what it is, as long as it creates some level of a strong emotion. That
mhm,
one is going to be a memory that you probably won't forget, and two, you're being reinforced by that as well.
mhm,
So that's just kind of the surfing piece. But
mhm,
with young people, they're in constant communication with their friends. They can even play video games with their friends and not be in the same place. And when I say they, that's everyone. I personally don't play video games because I have to be the best at it. And so
yeah.
I'm going to be playing it too much. So I've avoided it. But,
Okay.
but I
Mhm,
mean, who imagined a world? I mean, I can remember video games when I was younger,
mhm,
and we all would go to whoever had the video game
mhm,
and we take turns, and that would be it. But now they have earphones on. It's like live
mhm.
combat and everything else. And so it's just very interesting how that's happened. But let me go back to your question. I want to make sure I give it as much credence as I can here.
Yeah.
Cell phones, they're a form of reinforcement. So whether it's social media, whether it's communicating with your friends, whether it's um, let's be honest, young people are gambling online, young people are looking at pornography. There's all sorts of stimuli on a cell phone that's going to feed into that reward center of your brain. So yes, unequivocally, cell phones are contributing to addiction in general, but you have to look at the individual. So there might be a young person who likes their cell phone, but they kind of prefer reading books or they prefer something else. You got
Yeah.
this other young person who is, you can't get the cell phone out of their hand. So it's at an individual level. They can be in the same household, um, exposed to the same factors, and can very much be different. So it's at the individual level is important.
Wow. Wow. And I was when I was studying for this, I read that. Actually, let me go back here. There's a movie by National Geographic. It's called "Stress: A Portrait of a Killer," right?
Hmm.
Uh, where filmmakers examine how one's position in the social hierarchy affects stress levels.
Hmm. Hmm.
The film demonstrates how people who are lower on the hierarchy have higher levels of stress. You sort of kind of touch a little bit on this, So,
Mhm, mhm.
uh, so which leads to mental health and physical health problems. So, Dr. Outlaw, would you say people of color are more susceptible to addiction due to stress? Because we know that for the most part, they find themselves at the lower level of hierarchy.
I would actually disagree with that. I don't think
Okay.
that people of color are more
Mm.
susceptible to it. I think the conditions that we're in
Yeah.
create the stress, right? And so if we were to flip it and take put people on an island, for example, and the island is really big, and you're going to put all the people of color, they're going to run the island, they're going to have all the resources,
Mhm.
and they're going to have all the finances, they're going to be in government. And you
Mhm.
put all the non-people of color on the other side of the island, and they are dirt poor, and they're barely living, and there's drugs and alcohol
Mhm.
that's rampant in that area. Guess what?
Mhm.
Those individuals or that particular part of town,
Mhm.
or the island in this example, they're going to have a higher usage rate. Uh,
Mhm.
Productivity is another part that we don't talk about a lot with the addictive literature. But let's say that you are someone who you have a job in which you're happy to have, and you want to move up the ladder, and you are just killing it. You're doing all the work and so forth. That person is going to be a little bit less likely to use. I mean, of course, he or she may have other personal stressors, but they're going to be focused on whatever it is that's going to get them to that next level. And that occupies some time in which they could consider using drugs or alcohol as well. So, just to reiterate, I don't think people of color are more susceptible. It's just that our conditions that we unfortunately have been exposed to in this world, not just this country, in this world, have led to that. And this goes, all the way to white supremacy. And not to make this a political discussion here, but there are certain powers that are in place that want to continue to see
It's almost
Europeans at the forefront of the entire world and control, the resources of the world. And so, it's not even a theory. It certainly is true. And what that means is that people who are not Europeans and don't fit into that group, you're going to have a harder time because you're not, you're not the saved one that's here at the top, and you got to find your own way.
mm. uh, Dr. Outlaw, have you heard of stories where people of color or especially black people were denied certain drugs uh,
Mm, mm. Yeah,
because
yeah,
yeah, because
yeah.
they
There's been a lot.
Mhm.
Sorry to
Right.
cut you off, but there's been a lot in both anecdotal evidence as well as in the literature that
Mhm.
shows that people of color are denied
Mhm.
painkillers
Mhm.
in higher frequency. So, I mean, there's lots of reasons for this, but one is um, black women are seen as resilient. Oh, you'll be fine. You're so strong. That whole "you're so strong" argument is part of it. There's also another part where, I mean, the doctors do understand that by prescribing pain medication, which is an addictive substance, that there's a chance that they become addicted to it. And I don't think there's always some nefarious sort of reasoning behind it, but I think at times the doctors are like, well, I don't want to see this person addicted. And in their biased mind, that just
Mhm.
because you're a doctor doesn't mean that you don't have bias, but in their
Yeah,
mind, this is a person of color,
yeah,
and people of color use drugs and alcohol at higher rates. I don't want
yeah,
to be the one to contribute to that. Now, it'd
yeah,
be nice if they had a broader understanding of kind of what contributes to it, kind of
yeah,
as we discussed in here today, but it's certainly almost fact
yeah.
that
Mhm.
people of color are being prescribed medications that can help them at lower rates, and so therefore they're left to suffer. And so, guess what they do? They go find other methods to cope with the pain and the agony, whether it's a physical pain or a mental pain. And so, as opposed to taking a pill, now they're out purchasing things off the street, other illicit drugs, and so that very much is a problem as well.
Wow. Yeah, let's get into this the opioid epidemic. So
Yeah.
alone 2017, 72,000 American lives were lost to opioids.
Hmm. Yeah.
Uh,
Well, here's
Although, and of course, although most, overdose, those who overdose were white people,
mhm.
but it's still an American problem.
So this is where we go back to race again. So
Yeah.
unfortunately, I mean, no one wants to see anyone, any group of people
Mm,
perish to addiction. I don't think anyone really wants that. Unfortunately, opioids in this country have become a problem. And for reasons that we just described a moment ago, it's
mm,
become more of a problem for European Americans than it has for people of color. They are at the largest percentage of the death rate, of the usage rate, of the addiction rate of what we just described. Unfortunately, the only reason why it's even an epidemic is because it's affecting Europeans. If this was affecting African Americans as the heroin and crack cocaine epidemic of the 80s and 90s, it wasn't an epidemic then. Now,
mhm,
there were certain programs that were out there. It's not like they just completely ignored it, but the level of attention and the level of scrutiny about the contributing factors, causes, as well as treatments and cures is way different now. And so that's like the hard part. It's hard for people of color to empathize with folks who are going through the opioid epidemic because we remember very clearly,
mm,
20 years ago, what our family went through. And this is part of what led to the breaking down of the family structure of African Americans, is because drugs were at the forefront, and
right.
drugs and education in the prison system went all hand in hand. And
Please talk about that. Yes.
it very much
Mm,
and continues to affect us to this day.
yeah.
You can take someone who was born in 1980, and so they're roughly 40 years old.
Mm,
Actually, they're exactly 40 years old, and due to the drug epidemic that we went through as people of color, their father may have gone to prison, for life because of that. And so
right.
there, it was punitive when we went through it. People of color, let's throw the book at them and let's criminalize this as best as we can. Now it's a disease and it's an addiction, right?
Yeah.
And we need to treat these people, and we need to treat them with compassion. So
Yeah.
once again, that's the hard part that
Mm,
makes it difficult for us to empathize. And it's differential treatment, as has been the case in many other areas of life.
mm,
But they both were addictions, and they both were medically described. It just would have been nice if we would have been treated with compassion and treatment as opposed to criminalized.
mm. So talk about the solutions in general to a lot of these addictions.
Yeah, I'll say this: a big part of it is information, right? So if you understand how ingesting a drug into your body and what the half life of that drug is. In other words, how long is it before it eliminates from your system? If
Mm,
you understand how addictive that drug is, because there are drugs that are more addictive than others. If you understand the reward center of the brain and how dopamine is released, and if you understand how stress and drug usage is a part of a coping strategy to dealing with stress, and if you understand that this is in fact qualified as a disease of the brain,
mm,
you might decide, I'm not even going to try this.
mhm, mhm,
Or even if you decide to experiment, if you understand all those things that I just mentioned a moment ago, you have a different viewpoint on it.
mm,
But there are a lot of people who think, I can just stop when I want, and they don't necessarily see it as a problem. They
right.
won't define it as a problem. And so therefore, they're stuck in that cycle kind of indefinitely. What they say is the first step is to identify that you have a problem. And so if you're unwilling to do that because partially you don't have the information, you're going to be stuck in that cycle a little bit longer, right?
Right. So why are programs such as AA or 12 steps, sometimes they fail, you know.
Yeah, and you know what? I want to go back because I didn't fully
Please
answer your
go
question.
back.
I
Yeah.
said the first step is information, right? And so
Yeah.
that's part
Yeah.
of it.
Mm,
Secondly, and I'm biased here because I'm a psychologist, and so I
yeah.
strongly feel as if treatment programs, both outpatient and inpatient treatment programs, do a really good job. Sometimes we have to detox an individual before we do any real work. So if they currently have a lot of that drug in their system and they are physiologically connected and addicted to that drug to the point where they will have withdrawal symptoms, sometimes a detox program is kind of that first step, right? Then after that, then it is a psychoeducation around it. And then it's also a lifelong thing.
So
When we
what do
talk
you
about,
guys do in the first step?
I'm sorry?
In the first step, like
Detox. So, okay, let me describe that as I
okay,
made some assumptions there. So a detox program
uh,
is really just a program where um, they it's like a hospital setting. There's going to be nurses and doctors, and they're going to make sure you're comfortable while the drug is eliminating itself from your body. So, for example, if you are addicted to heroin, you're going to have withdrawal symptoms. You're going to have nausea. You're going to have headaches. You're going to have the shakes. You're going to have body temperature issues. You're going to have all sorts of physiological effects of your body trying to get used to that drug being out of your system. And guess what? If that person who's going through withdrawal symptoms was to take that drug again, those withdrawal symptoms go away, right? And so
mm,
that's part of what keeps people in it, is that they can't make it through that withdrawal phase. So a detox program is a medically supervised program where they're going to give you other medication to help you feel comfortable with it, and they're going to see you through that initial process. So the drug is now out of your system, and you won't have withdrawals anymore, theoretically, and you can kind of focus on some other things. And of course, who would want to go through a treatment program while they're still half high, right? Like, what
right,
exactly are you going to take from a
right,
program if you're still going through it in that sense? And
right.
then from there, there's intensive outpatient programs, which mean that you're going to be going to a program more than once a week. You have inpatient program, which can be 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. You can also have outpatient program, which is like once a week. So there's like different continuum of how much or how in-depth the treatment can really be for you. And it
Mm,
really just depends on your individual situation that may define what level of care that you actually need. And there
mm,
are people who really need the detox and the 90-day program, then the intensive outpatient, then the outpatient. And I think you alluded to it just a moment ago. An AA program is one of those programs where it's Alcoholics Anonymous, and there's Narcotics Anonymous, NA, and there's others as well.
mm,
Those programs they can be 3 times, 4 times a week. It can be up to 7 times a week.
mm,
And so that's an individual who's very much taking control of the fact that they know that they have an addiction and a disease that can relapse any given time,
mm,
and they are going to have to work on this every day to stay sober.
mm,
And that's kind of what it takes, because someone can go for 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years, and all it takes is one relapse, and they can be right on back in it like it never stopped.
mm, mm. You know, in the first step, I remember I listened a lot to this clinical psychologist out of Canada.
Okay.
His name is Dr. Peterson.
Okay.
All of a sudden, he was taken to Russia uh, because of something that was going on with his wife. So he was sort of kind of addicted to this drug that he was taking. So he was
Mhm.
taken to Russia, and they put him to sleep. I don't know for how long. I don't know if it was like,
Hmm.
So I guess that's pretty much the what you just described right now. Because sometimes they have to take this drug out of you, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, definitely looking at the more um, hardcore sort of drugs, it 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 takes over, right? And it's hard to go moments while you're in the midst of it without thinking about that drug, without needing that drug to give you that next high. And so, very much so, a detox program, it's not required, but it's almost, highly recommended at the 90% rate on
Right.
some of those higher level pieces. And saying, I mean, it can be cannabis or marijuana, doesn't mean that you can't do an inpatient program for that as well, depending on the severity of your addiction.
Right. I know somebody who quit the program, the TROPS, because I think he said that, just too many rules or too, so
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think that's somebody who's not really serious, right? I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, it depends. And so, one of the most common arguments against the 12 step is that it has a religious component to it. And not everyone is religious. There are agnostics and atheists and people who believe in other types of religions. And so, it very much has a pretty large religious component to it.
Mhm.
That's one piece of it. Another piece is that it requires, you to submit to your higher power and admit that you have an addiction and you have a problem. Some people don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And then, just kind of as you alluded to a moment ago, some people look for any excuse in the world to say, "Oh, that didn't work for me." But
Mhm.
guess what? Their commitment is with that substance, right? And so that's a sign or an indicator that someone may not be ready for work. We call that the pre-contemplation stage within the addiction literature. So if you're in the pre-contemplation stage,
Mhm.
you're not even thinking about whether this is something that you want to really take seriously. The contemplation stage is, you know what? There are some things that are going on in my life that are problematic and I probably should. And then the action phase is when you're actually kind of in it, right? And you're willing to do the work. So we got to be able to identify where people are. And the
Mhm.
pre-contemplation stage is one in which you can send them to the best program in the world for $100,000 a month, and they're still not going to make any progress.
Mhm. Let's go back to this internet thing that we just talked about, a moment ago. So, what is the solution for, or how do you detox from overuse of internet? So
Okay, yeah. So whether we're talking internet or a cell phone or what have you,
yeah, so
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. No, this is a very good question.
Mm.
So um, the first step, in my opinion, is
Mm.
really to have a sit down. So whether this is a child or an adult,
Mm.
the sit down is the same thing. It's like, look, we really have a problem here,
Mm.
right? And I need you to listen to me.
Mm.
And this is almost like an intervention in a way.
Mm.
You got to have that serious conversation, and you hope that that person picks up on it and says, well, you know what? Now I look at my phone, I look at my history. You're right. I'm on the cell phone or on the internet 13 hours a day. I didn't realize that. I thought it was more like 4. So that has to be a first step. From there, I think in this, I'm a little bit hesitant just because someone's addiction to the internet can be different things. It can be pornography, it
Mm.
can be gambling, it can be shopping and spending, it
Mm.
can be, it can be lots of different things. And so there's no one way of really addressing how do we tackle an internet addiction, because we got to know, kind of what it's really about. But
Some kids, that, oh, not even kids, like
Mhm,
the older people, when they see
sure,
notifications on their phones, they're addicted to that, right? Like, ooh,
sure, sure,
get
sure.
that
Yeah,
notification.
a notification is almost like a hit, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
So if you get a notification, someone has contacted you, whether it's a text message or social media has popped up or whatnot. So it's the possibility of that being something that's interesting to you.
Right.
So
Right.
just that alone, excuse me, is enough to give at least a small release of dopamine. So let's talk about kind of the solution here on terms of that. So
Yeah.
once again, there's no cookie cutter approach, but
Right.
the individual is going to have to take responsibility and understand that this is in fact a problem. If they don't do that, you're not making any progress at all.
Hmm.
Secondly, it's important that they find some other activities to replace
Hmm.
their their time spent, right? And so that's easier said than done, but what it ultimately is doing is removing the reinforcement of the internet from being a constant thing, right? So every time that they're on the internet or on their phone, they're getting reinforcement for it. So if
Hmm.
you remove and replace that with something else, let's just say now you give them a book to read, and you know what, I'm going to pay you $500 if you can read these 5 books in a month. And they're like, wow, I really want that money, so I'm going to go ahead and read it. And now you're removing that frequent reinforcement and that frequent dopamine release based on their addiction, and you're replacing it with something else. That connection, that neural connection, is not as strong. Now, within a month, I'm not going to suggest that all of a sudden their addiction is gone forever, but by
Hmm.
by eliminating or reducing that dopamine push, you can make some progress. And they can say, oh, well, I really did enjoy reading those books. And I'm thinking I'm going to continue to do that. So that's kind of one way, but certainly you got to remove the stimulus, which is the computer or the phone, from their grasp, or you're not making any progress at all. My other recommendation in that sense, and once again, I'm biased, would be for them to work with a psychologist and to kind of figure out all the details and their triggers and the nuances behind why they relapsed, for example, or continue to use despite negative consequences. And you can learn that about yourself, your individual self, in the therapeutic process. So my thought is that if we put them all together, they've admitted that they have a problem. Two, we've removed the stimulus from their grasp 13 hours a day. And three, we've given them some education about them on an individual psychological level. And they now are armored up with understanding of their triggers and the things that contribute to their usage. Then they got a pretty good chance. And then that's a daily thing, right? Like if we're talking about someone who's truly addicted, you don't learn about yourself and then all of a sudden you're good to go, you're done. That's a daily thing, arguably indefinitely.
I mean, you help a lot of these people. So what if somebody, you prescribing, some of the solutions to him, but he goes back to that environment, to that community? It's kind of hard to get out of that situation,
So you raise a really good point. And I don't think we've talked about this very much. So I think this is a good point that you made. But addiction is very difficult to treat. In other words, people relapse a lot throughout their life. Sometimes people are in the midst of a relapse for years, and sometimes people will have made progress and then they relapse thereafter. So it's important that we all understand that this is not some you do a couple things here and there and all of a sudden they're good to go and they're cured. This is something that unless they're doing some daily work at this, it is really easy for them to slip back into old behaviors and old habits. And then you look up and you're like, oh my God, how'd I get here? Like that's a very real thing that happens a lot with people who have addiction, is that they don't even realize that they've done X, Y, and Z, and now they've relapsed.
Wow. Since you were talking about treatment, I want you to take, the moment to really message of hope, your last words.
So I just kind of gave a moment ago, I painted a picture that addiction is something that people struggle with for a lifetime, and that people relapse many times, and people can be in the midst of a relapse for a good amount of time. But I also want to say this, that we have really good treatment options out there. We have, right now at least, we have Affordable Care Act, which has provided health insurance to many people who wouldn't have been insured otherwise. And ultimately, if someone is willing to take the necessary steps to deal with their addiction, they can make progress and they can remain sober. They can remain free from that addictive piece for a good amount of time. And there are people who never turn back to that thing. And so I do want to paint a hopeful picture, just because I wouldn't be doing the type of work that I do if I didn't feel as if it was effective, right? And so not only do we have that anecdotal information in terms of clients that I've worked with, but there's a huge amount of research that looks at addiction and the types of treatment options that are more successful as opposed to treatment options that aren't as successful. So it's good for everyone to know that we're in a good time in the history of addiction. We understand a lot more about it. I mean, only within the last 15, 20 years did we even see it as a true disease. Before, the entire medical community saw it as, not the entire medical community, but I'd say the world in general saw it as a choice. They saw it as weak people who are weak-minded,
Mm.
decided to use drugs, and until your uncle and and your cousin are in it and they had a successful job, like, wait a minute, I thought this was a choice, and why would you choose to use? So there's a lot more understanding and empathy as a whole
Mm.
about it as well. So this is a good time in the history of our country, in this world,
Mm.
if in fact there is an addiction, to seek treatment, because they're rather effective.
Wow. So do you guys do counseling as well? Or?
Yeah, no, I do psychotherapy with a number of clients that I have on my caseload right now who
Mhm.
have different addictions, and I wish I could talk about it more, but it's
Yeah.
one of those things where sometimes the addictions are so unique that
Mm.
it will, break and breach confidentiality. So I want to make sure I don't do that. But yeah, all therapists work in addiction in some capacity. Sometimes they may present with depression, and then you find out that they're addicted to alcohol. And it's like, okay, now we got two things to work on, although you didn't necessarily mention it in the beginning.
Mm.
And both are just as equally as important in terms of treatment. So, all in all, I just want to say to everyone who might be listening, and maybe people who are also in the midst of an addiction,
Mm.
there are some really good treatment options out there. And
Mm.
if you've gotten to a place where you're beyond the pre-contemplation stage and you're ready for action,
Mm.
you'll definitely make some progress, and you'll notice that in time you're happy you made that decision.
Mm. I don't know if it's okay with you, because we're gonna put up this podcast. You know,
Hmm.
some people might, want to reach out and
Sure.
say,
Yeah.
yeah.
I'll give my website. My website is journeysci.com. So that's JOURNEYPSY. So like the
Mm.
prefix of psychology.
Mm.
Journeysci.com. I don't necessarily, and you're inspiring me too, Sonny. I think I need to have a link on my website for some basic information. I
Right.
don't currently have that right now, but if people are wanting to reach out, whether for treatment options or questions, there's
Right.
a form on the website that they can complete, and somebody will
Right.
get back to them on that as well.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Outlaw.
Yes.
Appreciate you, man.
Yes.
All right.
Likewise.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thanks you again.
everybody, for listening in. That was Dr. Outlaw. Thank you.